Welcome back to Reviews with Elaine, because I have opinions. And today's opinions will be about The Element of Fire by Martha Wells. So this is one of those books that if you were to describe it to me on paper, I would tell you there's no way in God's green earth I'm going to like it. This has a lot of court intrigue in the narrative, and I'm not fond of court intrigue books. It has a romantic subplot with an age gap, which is something I usually find very squirky. It has a lot of the, who can we trust kind of conflict, which is some of my least favorite kinds of conflict. And yet, I absolutely loved this book. Okay. So, The Element of Fire takes place in the same world as Death of the Necromancer and the Fall of Ilrain series, but it takes place a good 100 years before any of the other stories. We are in what is this world's equivalent of the mid-1800s in Ilrain. Thomas Boniface is our hero, and he is the head of the Queen's Guard and Queen Ravina's favorite. His job is to protect her and to basically be her hand at court. Ravina is the current king's mother, and this is not a happy, well-aligned, everybody getting along together kind of court. King Roland is perceived as really weak, and he's basically being led around by his ambitious and greedy favorite, Denzil. And now a foreign sorcerer named Urbain Grandier, I think is how we're going to pronounce it, seems to be plotting something in Ilrain. He has kidnapped the soon-to-be royal sorcerer, Galen Dubel, and no one's quite sure why. On top of this, the king's half-sister, the mad fae sorceress Cade, has suddenly shown back up in Ilrain. Now Thomas has to figure out who is in league with who, what the hell they are trying to do, and who is in danger. All while keeping his head on his shoulders, his queen alive, and Ilrain from falling into war. So yeah, I really loved this book. It had the vibes of what I wished The Three Musketeers was. And specifically, I have never read The Three Musketeers. I don't know it for sure, but I've heard enough about what happens in that book that there's some things that I just feel like cannot be excused away by good writing that I know happen in that book. So I just have lost the desire to read it. And this sort of had the vibes of the fantasy novel version, where the characters aren't absolute monsters. But Thomas Boniface is the kind of character that I wish D'Artagnan was. He is arrogant, yes, and all the ladies do fall in love with him, and he's rather dismissive of that fact, but it's also clear that his arrogance is more just a complete awareness of his own competency, and it's heavily tempered by his own awareness of his flaws. Yes, it is mentioned that he has slept with half the court, but it's made explicitly clear that he is not cheating on his lover, that all the women consent and know what they're getting into, and that he is decidedly turned off by the notion that a woman might be feeling like she has to do anything with him. And while he teases his servants and even throws something at one of them at one point, it's clear that the relationship between him and his servants is one of mutual respect. He looks after them and admires their abilities. He trusts them to accomplish complex tasks, and they clearly trust him to be a leader. He does do some bad things throughout the book and referenced to having done in the past, but he is always trying to do the least damage to the innocents involved in every incident. And he's not carefree about any of it. He is clearly very aware of what he is doing and feels true empathy for the people he is dealing with. He is the version of the swashbuckling character that I can actually like. And on the note of characters, I fucking love both Ravina and Cade. Both are capable of great cruelty and coldness, but once again, they are immensely likable characters, and they are both two women characters who have a lot of strength and show it in a way that is not necessarily the traditional, I am a strong character and therefore I'm going to complain about corsets and attack people with swords. No, they have other kinds of strength. And I really love the fact that both are characters that we can definitely look at and go, well, yeah, you totally fucked that up. This is all your fault happening right now. But you understand why they are doing what they're doing, and you can fully empathize with the choices that they made. And Cade is such an interesting character, and specifically she's such an interesting study in how the perceptions of a character can shift between POVs. So we get some scenes from her POV in this book, and some scenes from people watching her. And when she's the POV character in the scene, she comes across very, very differently than when someone else is talking about her. And specifically, when someone else is the POV character, she comes across as very strange, disconnected, and sort of unemotional. But then when we see inside of her head, when we are at a close third with her, it feels significantly more like she's just the awkward, scared girl trying to work through some really complex emotions. And the disconnect between the two versions of her feels at first a bit like it's a mistake. But as we get to know both versions of her, what she seems like from the outside and what she seems like from the inside, what we actually get is this really detailed portrait of a character who has no idea how to let others into her world, and who doesn't feel like she fits in anywhere. And that is a character I can really like, and I will say, I don't think I've ever read a book that does a better job of showing us that dichotomy. Also, one of my favorite things that multi-POV novels can do is show us the difference in a way the characters see themselves versus how they actually look, / how others perceive them. So, like, we know that when we're in Cade's head, she perceives herself as plain looking. Like, she refers to herself as not interesting to look at or downright plain. But we know from other people's point of view that she actually is very interesting to look at, is described as looking sort of fey and otherworldly. But Thomas describes Cade as a creature of amber, rose, and old gold. One could never tire of looking at her, he decided. There was always something new to see, an effect made even more interesting because she produced it unintentionally and entirely without artifice. And I just feel like this difference between how a character describes themselves versus how others describes them tells us so much about what's going on in both those characters' heads. And in contrast to Cade, we have Thomas, who is fully aware of how attractive he is and how it has gotten him where he is now. And the way he's described is almost exactly the same from inside of his head and from outside of his head. And these create really interesting character portraits. I really think that the characters are the reason that I almost always love Martha Wells books. Though one minor stupid qualm here, and I know this one is really stupid and it's really nitpicky, but one of the characters' name is Denzil, and God help me, I could not stop reading that name as Denzel to myself. And so in my head, this character who is supposed to be a young, pretty blonde courtier is being played by Denzel Washington. And that just was an interesting contrast. But that was on me, but I will say, it's those stupid little things that will throw me out of the narrative. But also, once again, I feel like I have never really read an author who has a greater understanding of how to use space than Martha Wells has. The palace in this book is, and specifically, it's an entire palace complex. It's not just one building. And it was just referenced and I think maybe visited once in the previous Ilrain books, but here it gets all sorts of exploration. And holy hell, was it a complex, clearly mapped out, and emotive kind of building. I love the feeling that the feeling of time that this place encompassed. You could really feel the history of the building from Martha Wells's writing. And it's made up of dozens of different structures that were built across centuries, and it helps build this feeling that there's a deep history to the kingdom and the world that Martha Wells has created in these books. And on that note of history, fantasy as a genre is one that a lot of people often think of as including a lot of history, but truthfully, it really often does not. Especially in Second World or high fantasy, a lot of times people assume that because the technology is roughly equated to medieval Europe, then obviously this is actually set in something like medieval Europe and the history must be right. And most of the time, no. What fantasy authors are doing is creating a world that is not ours and therefore does not follow our history, does not necessarily follow the same development of technology, government, anything like that, the way that ours did. It doesn't need to be historically accurate because it's not history. It's just vaguely historically inspired. Now, that is why, at least in my own head, I always like to differentiate between historical fantasy versus just fantasy that happens to be vaguely inspired by medieval Europe or whatnot. But sometimes you'll find a fantasy that really clearly is more focused on the historical influence. Something that the author clearly did historical research and actually did try to include real world history in it. And hilariously, sometimes that's the fantasy that people will call out as being historically inaccurate. But I will say this is one of those books that had a lot more actual historical nods than I expected to find. There was like Commedia dell'arte in this book, and presented in a way that is actually a lot more accurate to what I understand of Commedia dell'arte than I've seen in a lot of books that have referenced it in passing. There were references to The Green Knight, which I absolutely love because my dad used to read me those stories, that story when I was a kid. But also the way the religion interacted with each other, the different religions, and how the Inquisition worked. Like, there were a lot of real historical nods here. And one of the things that really stood out in this category for me is the way Fae are treated in this book. It's just a lot more accurate to how the actual mythology of the Fae was in, like, say, the 1800s than what we've built up as an idea of what the Fae were in fantasy novels. Because, yeah, there are certain conceptions that we have just sort of as canon for fantasy that sometimes it comes out of actual mythology, sometimes it comes out of Tolkien, sometimes it's just sort of a conglomeration of enough authors decided that it looks like this and now it does. But this book, the way the three courts interacted with each other, the way that none of the courts were actually good, but were all at least slightly malevolent, but some more so than other. The monstrous plus the beauty, the complexity and the simplicity and the way that the Fae interact with humans, all of this felt like the actual old school legends, the actual stories from the 17 and 1800s of how Europe thought of the Fae. And in the other Ilrain books, the Fae are mentioned in passing as sort of like a threat of the past that you rarely run into anymore. But, you know, you might hit them. Sort of like, you know, the chance that you'll run into a wolf in modern day America. I mean, it could happen, but it's not really going to. But here the Fae are very present, are very current, and are very much a part of the narrative. And just like even the physical descriptions of the Fae were absolutely fascinating and horrifying in equal measures. And it really mastered that balance of the recognizable and the inhuman that are such a part of the draw of the Fae. Why fantasy has been interested in playing with these mythologies pretty much as long as fantasy has existed. And I loved the way it was treated in this book. There's also some really amazingly great action sequences in this book, especially really well written fights. I like the touches that show that Wells actually did a good bit of research as to how fighting with like a rapier and a main gauche and all that stuff, how it would work in the time. But I also really appreciate the fact that she didn't feel the need to like lead us on incredibly long exposition dumps where she explains, well, actually, this is how it would have worked in history. Instead, it's just integrated it into the way the fight scenes work in a way that feels very accurate, very logical, and doesn't bog the story down. I also always love a book that does not shy away from giving the protagonist serious injuries and having those injuries accumulate and decidedly affect the way the rest of the book is running. And yeah, Thomas in particular in this book took a fucking beating! And he kept on fighting, which is also just one of my favorite tropes of all times for characters, and I can blame anime for this, but there's no character that I like more than the one that keeps getting almost completely slaughtered and just barely standing back up and being like, no, I keep fighting because that's where strength is. So yeah, I love that character that's going to keep fighting out of sheer stubbornness, and we have that in this book. And the last major element I want to talk about here that I feel like really needs to be addressed is the romance. Yes, this book includes a romantic subplot. It is a subplot, it's not the main plot, which is one of the things I like. And without going into too many details, because I don't want to do any spoilers here, I will say this is a romance that I usually would have been like, ooh, that's a bit squirky, I'm not sure about that, that's uncomfortable. Because, like, there's a pretty big age gap. Like, I don't think it's actually defined by years, but he knew her when she was a child. He is at least 20 years older than her. Or well, at least probably 15 years older than her. And he had a long-term relationship with someone else in her family. Like, there's a lot that could cause that awkward power imbalance that makes romance feel a little bit exploitative. But this book handles it with a really deft hand. It's clear he was not doing anything even slightly problematic as when she was young. Like, they've been separated for a very long time, so like there's reasons for him to see her as a new person and for her to see him as a new person. Like, it didn't come across squirky the way I feel like it usually would have. And this is a romance that in the time period, in like the 1800s in our world, this sort of romance wasn't that unusual. So I like the fact that it did have that nod to the history that it wasn't uncommon in the 1800s for a woman in her 20s to be married to a man in his 40s or 50s. And so, like, I like the fact that this was included in such a way that it did not feel problematic. At least to me, but you know, your mileage may vary on all these things. There's also a character death in this book that I think is a fucking masterful work. Like, sometimes I just want a beloved character to go out in a blaze of glory. It's fun, and it's nice to have a character death where the feels are sort of triumphant and almost positive. That you and the other characters can, yes, mourn for the character, but still feel the power and this control of this death. And I really liked it. And like, I feel like sometimes authors, especially in the modern world, shy away from giving any positive feels whatsoever to a death, because in our society, death is intrinsically a bad thing. There is really no such thing as the good death anymore. We don't think of it as like oh, well, he died in a blaze of glory, so that's a success. We think of it as, yeah, but he died. And I actually really like the fact that no, sometimes the happy ending can be the character getting the death that they wanted, getting to change the world, even if that does mean losing their own life in the process. And I feel like this book really managed to walk that line, that you can see the tragedy in the death while also seeing the triumph in it. I also want to quickly say I have no idea why this book is called The Element of Fire. Like, I know it's from a poem. The poem is quoted at the beginning. It's a John Donne poem, but it's one that I haven't read. So I'm wondering if maybe if I read the rest of the poem, I'd understand what the hell this name has to do with the rest of the book. And, like, there's no elemental magic in here. Fire appears, but it's nowhere near the most common type of magic that we see. Fire power exists in the way of guns, but it's not like they are a world-shattering new invention in this book. It's just they exist. And, like, I don't know why the book is called The Element of Fire. And I've never had this effect with any other Martha Wells books. Like, all her other books have titles that are either really fucking straightforward, descriptive of the major theme or elements of the book, or the kind of title that seems like they're really straightforward, and then it turns out there's a hidden layer that you tease out later. And I know that that's not a super important thing, but it is something I think about, so I did spend the latter half of the book going, but why is it called The Element of Fire? And I kept forgetting the name of the book because I was like, it has nothing to do with the book. I don't get it. And a weird part of my brain wonders if maybe that was because it was originally supposed to be part of a series, and the name would have made more sense with the other names of the series, and the rest of the series just never got written, or at least never got published. And that's not because this book feels incomplete. This stands alone well. It feels like a true standalone novel. It doesn't need a sequel, and I'm not even entirely sure where it would go if there was a sequel, but there are enough important side characters, enough depth built into the backstory, and enough interesting elements that were introduced and useful for the book, but, you know, weren't a major part of it, that I do feel like there is somewhere else Wells could have gone with this world. Like, maybe she did originally intend this to be, like, one of a loosely connected series. But I think that also could just be wishful thinking on my part, because as far as I know, this is the only book set in this time frame, in this world, that Martha Wells wrote, and I just sort of wish there were more, because I really liked it. And inevitably, when I read a standalone that I really like, I'm sitting there being like, why isn't it a series? I want there to be more. But that has nothing to do with the book feeling incomplete. This book does feel complete. So yeah, overall, I really like this book, even though it has all sorts of things I usually state as things I don't like. Which does just go across to show that a really masterful author can make any trope more than just the trope. It's also one of those books that shows why I very rarely DNF a book in the first few chapters. Like, unless there's something actively offensive or infuriating going on, or like something emotionally damaging to me, I'm generally gonna give it like at least a full third of the book before I consider quitting. Because, like, I loved this book, but the first few chapters were introducing so much that I wasn't really into it. I was feeling a little bit like I was reading a textbook, trying to learn all the names, the places, the faces, trying to connect all the dots. And if I'd quit then because I wasn't into the book, I would have missed what I think might be my favorite read of the year so far. So yeah, I would definitely suggest reading The Element of Fire. Give it a couple of chapters. The first is a bit it's not even slow, there is action, it's just hard to figure out exactly what's going on, but read on, this book is worth it.